What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 2.
Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over the quarterback position and give you my 2019 fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 2. This should help you decide who you want to start in your season-long fantasy football leagues. And we will show you how to use the Draft Dashboard tools to dominate your season-long fantasy leagues. You can find waiver wire targets, get player point projections, find the best positional matchups to see who is projected to score the most fantasy points this week. These tools will help you decide what players to start in your fantasy football leagues. We have it all right here, so let's get into it. Okay guys, NFL fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 2. Let's take a look at the quarterback position. I'm going to start Matthew Stafford from the Detroit Lions playing the Green Bay Packers, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Matthew Stafford, he's averaging 17.2 fantasy points per game on the season. He got 5 rush attempts last week, scored 17 fantasy points. He's projected at 16.7 fantasy points here in Week 2. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Detroit Lions trailing by 6. So this is a nice matchup for Stafford. It should be a passing game script. He should be on the field passing the ball a ton. So I like Matthew Stafford here versus the Green Bay Packers. Okay, at the quarterback position, I'm going to sit Jared Goff from the LA Rams playing the Philadelphia Eagles, who have the 10th best defense overall, and they give up the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Jared Goff is averaging 11.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He got 4 rush attempts last game, scored 12 fantasy points. Now he's projected at 17.7 fantasy points here in Week 2. But this is a tough matchup for Jared Goff. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 46 points scored in this game, with the Rams favored by 1.5. He's not the worst quarterback option here in Week 2. But if you have another comparable quarterback on your roster, I would go with them until we see more out of Jared Goff. So I'm going to sit Jared Goff here versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. I'm going to start Jonathan Taylor from the Indianapolis Colts playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Jonathan Taylor averaging 11.9 fantasy points per game on the season. He got 6 pass targets last game and 9 rush attempts. Now the reason I'm going to start Jonathan Taylor is because Marlon Mack is out with a torn Achilles, so he's going to be the number 1 running back for the Colts. Didn't take him long to find his way to the top of the depth chart there. He's projected at 10.5 fantasy points here in Week 2. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Colts favored by 3. It's a fantastic matchup. So I like Jonathan Taylor here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Another running back that I'm going to start here in Week 2 is David Johnson from the Houston Texans playing the Baltimore Ravens, who have the 2nd best defense overall, and they give up the 7th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. David Johnson is averaging 18.4 fantasy points per game on the season. He got 4 targets last game and 11 rush attempts, scored 18 fantasy points. He's projected at 12.5 fantasy points here in Week 2. Now, despite the bad matchup for David Johnson, I like him in Week 2 because Vegas thinks there's going to be 52.5 points scored in this game. They have the Houston Texans trailing by 6.5, but he's involved in the passing game, so he'll be on the field catching passes even if they fall behind. He was impressive in week 1. Looks like he fits that Houston Texans offense pretty well. So I'm going to start David Johnson here versus the Baltimore Ravens. Okay, so I'm going to sit Phillip Lindsay. Now, he did go out with an ankle injury, so we're waiting on an injury status update. But even if he's good to go here in week 2, I'm going to sit Phillip Lindsay from the Denver Broncos playing the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have the 7th best defense overall, and they're giving up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. Phillip Lindsay only averaged 4 fantasy points last game. He only got 1 target and 7 rush attempts. Now, yes, he did get injured, but like I said, even if he's healthy, he's going up against a Pittsburgh Steelers team who was a shutdown run defense in week 1. Lindsay is only projected at 7.3 fantasy points here in week 2, and it's going to be a low-scoring game. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, with the Denver Broncos trailing by 6.5, so not a favorable game script. So I'm going to sit Phillip Lindsay here versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. I'm going to start Allen Robinson from the Chicago Bears playing the New York Giants, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Allen Robinson is averaging 9.8 fantasy points per game on the season. He got 9 pass targets last game and 1 rush attempt. He was on the field for 82% of the snaps, scored 10 fantasy points in week 1. He's projected at 13.5 fantasy points here in week 2. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, with the Chicago Bears favored by 5.5. So I like the matchup. This guy's getting a ton of targets. So I'm going to start Allen Robinson here versus the New York Giants.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
The other wide receiver I'm going to start is Marquise Brown from the Baltimore Ravens playing the Houston Texans, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Marquise Brown is averaging 12.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He got 6 pass targets last game, scored 13 fantasy points. He's projected at 10.5 fantasy points here in week 2. Now, Vegas thinks there's going to be 52.5 points scored in this game, so a high-scoring game with the Baltimore Ravens favored by 6.5. This guy continues to be one of Lamar Jackson's favorite receivers. He's got a great matchup here in week 2, so I'm going to start Marquise Brown here versus the Houston Texans. Okay, so I'm going to sit Larry Fitzgerald from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Washington Football Team, who have the 9th best defense overall, and they give up the 9th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Larry Fitzgerald only is averaging 5.4 fantasy points per game on the season. He got 5 pass targets in week 1. He was on the field for 79% of the snaps, but he's only projected at 6.7 fantasy points here in week 2. This guy's just not the player that he used to be. He's facing a tough matchup in week 2. Vegas thinks there's going to be 46 points scored in this game, with the Arizona Cardinals favored by 6.5. So not a favorable game script. They could get up on this Washington football team and run the ball to kill the clock. So I'm going to sit Larry Fitzgerald here versus the Washington football team. I'm also going to sit Randall Cobb from the Houston Texans playing the Baltimore Ravens, who have the second best defense overall, and they give up the third fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Randall Cobb is only averaging 3.3 fantasy points per game on the season. He only got 3 pass targets last game, although he was on the field for 78% of the snaps, only scoring 3 fantasy points. They really weren't looking his way very much, so he may not be as involved in the passing offense as some people might have thought. He's only projected at 7.7 fantasy points here in week 2. Vegas does think this is going to be a high-scoring game with 52.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Houston Texans trailing by 6.5. So it could be a passing game script for the Houston Texans, but I don't think it's going to be till Randall Cobb. So I'm going to sit Randall Cobb here versus the Baltimore Ravens. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. I'm going to start Jonnu Smith from the Tennessee Titans playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. Jonnu Smith averaging 11.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He got 7 pass targets last game, scored 12 fantasy points. Now he's only projected at 6.9 fantasy points here in week 2, but it's a pretty decent matchup. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, with the Tennessee Titans favored by 10.5. So the only risk here is that the Tennessee Titans get out to a big lead over the Jacksonville Jaguars and they abandon the passing game. But the Tennessee Titans didn't look all that great in week 1, so I think Jacksonville is going to keep this game closer than they're giving credit for. So I'm going to start Jonnu Smith here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. I'm also going to start O.J. Howard from the Tampa Bay Bucks playing the Carolina Panthers, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. O.J. Howard is averaging 11.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He got 6 pass targets in week 1, scored 12 fantasy points. He's projected at 5.3 fantasy points here in week 2, but he's got a pretty good matchup here, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game. They have the Tampa Bay Bucks favored by 9. So he's got Tom Brady throwing him the ball. I like that he got 6 pass targets last game. He was productive, and I think that continues here into week 2. So I'm going to start O.J. Howard here versus the Carolina Panthers. Okay, who are we going to sit at the tight end position? I'm going to sit Mike Gesicki from the Miami Dolphins playing the Buffalo Bills, who have the 4th best defense overall, and they give up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Mike Gesicki only averaging 4.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He got 5 pass targets in week 1. He was on the field for 73% of the snaps, but he only scored 5 fantasy points. He's projected at 7.5 fantasy points here in week 2, but he's facing a tough Buffalo defense, and it's going to be a low-scoring game. Vegas only thinks there's going to be 42 points scored in this game, with the Miami Dolphins trailing by 5.5. So if you've got better options at the tight end position, I would sit Mike Gesicki here versus the Buffalo Bills.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite
Player for this NFL slate.
I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again and good luck.